Nothing ever happens. You might have already seen this internet meme that basically conveys a highly skeptical stance towards overblown expectations of radical social changes that many people repeatedly claim must surely be soon coming. Surely, the populations of the West won't put up with their society's dysfunctional economic and political systems for much longer. The Western man must, at some point, run out of patience with the decadent managerial elite utterly detached from the population, pushing for uncontrolled mass immigration, ecologically justified deindustrialization, and various ideological attacks on the cultural identity of native Westerners. After the tipping point comes, things will get wild, and the regime's fortunes will be hanging by a thread. Well, I hate to be that person once again, but things seem to be more complicated than that. In this video, I'm about to once again visit the local pharmacy, equipped with a prescription for a bottle of my most beloved pharmaceutical product, the black pill. I have just finished a book by demographer Paul Morland called Tomorrow's People, where he, among many other things, basically explains why the nothing ever happens meme is actually sort of correct. This book is this video's primary source, and I will reference it multiple times. Now, it is obviously a meme. Stuff does actually happen all the time, but not the sort of stuff that people, explicitly or implicitly, wish for or think is needed or warranted, at least in terms of intensity. Now, I know this is not really that surprising, coming from a guy running a demographics-focused YouTube channel, but the key and underappreciated variable here is, you guessed it, demographics. More specifically, the median age of the population. We are by far the oldest societies in human history in terms of median age. In this matter, we are profoundly different from every human society before, let's say, the second half of the 20th century. That inevitably profoundly influences how we function and respond to stimuli. In this video, I'm going to show you how basically all the well-known violent internal state conflicts in the past century, such as civil wars, violent revolutions, terrorist campaigns, and so on, shared one crucial demographic variable: a massive part of the population being composed of young males. Historically, this was just a standard. Pretty much all societies before the second half of the 20th century were composed primarily of young people, and thus also young males. But not anymore. This simple fact that the contemporary world, and the developed world especially, is rapidly aging, and this specific demographic cohort is anything but abundant, is making any prospects of such spontaneous violent occurrences very unlikely. Scientists have discovered that human aging accelerates dramatically at 2 points in life, at 44 and 60 years. Ground News found 77 sources covering this, coming from across the political spectrum and the world, ensuring I get an on-the-ground perspective of every story I read, like this one. That's why I'm partnering with Ground News again for this video. They are an important tool I use in my research for this channel, and my personal news consumption. Ground News is an app and website that gathers related news from thousands of sources around the world, so readers can compare how different outlets cover the same story, with context on their political bias, credibility, and even who funds them. I personally love using their blind spot feed, which highlights important news receiving little coverage from the left or right. It helps me step outside of my echo chamber and see stories I might have missed because of my own biased news consumption. So, go to ground.news/Kaiser or scan my QR code to try them out today. My link saves you 40% on the same Vantage plan I use to get unlimited access to all their amazing features. You'd be supporting my work and an independent news platform I really trust at the same time. As I said, the world is demographically by far the oldest it has ever been. While there still are very young populations in certain areas, most noticeably in sub-Saharan Africa, huge swaths of the world are in demographically completely uncharted territory. There are many countries where the median age today is higher than the average life expectancy throughout most of human history. We often fail to appreciate this fact, but it makes us profoundly and deeply different as societies than were the societies inhabited by our ancestors. And we are thus likely to react very differently to similar circumstances than our ancestors would have. Now, the crucial thing to understand is that it is not the absolute number of young people that matters. It is the relative proportion of them in the population that does. Many states might have more young people now than in the pre-demographic transition times, since their populations were only a fraction of the current ones. There are many more young people in Japan or Italy than in Botswana, because those countries are much more populous. Still, in Botswana, almost everyone is young, and that is what creates the overall vibe of the society. Age structure is more important than the overall population numbers in these calculations. Society functions as a superorganism of sorts, maybe like a certain hive mind with some kind of Jungian collective unconsciousness, if you will, and its different age groups do not function in isolation from the rest of the society, but are mutually interconnected and influence each other. You have the horizontal axis, where people of the same age influence each other, but a similarly powerful vertical axis, where they are influenced by the other age groups. The fact that China will have much more young people than Guatemala in absolute numbers, even if it goes through an absolute population crash, does not change the fact that China will be the country crippled by population aging. Demographically, younger societies are much more culturally and economically dynamic, but also much more unstable and violent. Youthful vitality is just a coin with two sides, positive and negative. It is inseparable. Now the reasons for this are twofold. Firstly, it is biological. Young people are full of hormones such as testosterone, estrogen and progesterone, making them more violent, impulsive, risk-taking, emotionally volatile and gullible. Physical violence is, of course, a domain of specifically young males. This biological component is then combined with the fact that young males, unless they came from privileged backgrounds, usually have relatively little to lose, which makes them prone to support violent and radical social reforms or revolutions, due to the change of getting into a better social position after some new order is established. When you are a 20-year-old dude, one of 6 siblings, with very weak prospects of meaningful inheritance and of economically succeeding in a social order where you face massive competition, you might be highly incentivized to just flip the table completely. Because what can you really lose? That goes not only for participating in a civil war or a revolution, but also for engaging in crime, which is a high-risk, high-reward activity. You undertake an activity with a high risk of getting killed or imprisoned in order to gain money and a social position that would often be basically impossible to gain in legal ways. But if you are 35 or older, you have likely already gained some responsibilities and some social status in life. You might have a kid or two and need to put the food on that table. Even if you are not particularly successful, and maybe even unmarried and childless, it still feels like an insane thing to do to go somewhere and throw Molotov cocktails at the police. You cannot afford to lose your job, and you do not want to even think about being imprisoned. Those days of youthful shenanigans are long gone, and your back is starting to hurt now and then. Eventually, you change from the young person eager to get lost in the euphoric outburst of collective destructive energy on the streets, and become the middle-aged shopkeeper, worried about your business being looted. Then, there is also the perspective of the parents. If you have 6 children, you look very differently at the prospects of some of them engaging in a violent conflict with a high probability of dying. Your genetic line is secured. You have many children and grandchildren. But if you have 1 or 2 children, into which you have invested years of resources and nourishment, you will be very reluctant for your offspring to engage in any lethal activity, such as military conflict. The propensity towards violence is the darker side of the youth coin. But there is also the positive side. If societies manage to use this youthful vitality productively, they can achieve amazing cultural and economic results. The rise of the West to absolute world dominance in the 19th century happened under the backdrop of unprecedented population growth. Apart from technological innovation and military expansion, this also led to huge cultural blossoming in literature, music, philosophy, architecture, and the fine arts. The philosophical works of Friedrich Nietzsche, full of strength and vitality worship, that continue to fascinate readers to these days, were written in times when German women had 5 children on average. The same massive generations were then also filling the graves and trenches of Verdun and Somme. It is no coincidence that a similar cultural explosion in the West came in the 1960s, when the massive post-World War II generations were in their teens, and it created a revolution, whose fallout we are dealing with to this day. The median age in the United States in the 1960s was around 27 years. Northern Ireland, the 1970s and 1980s, height of the Troubles. We all know the images. Balaclavas, car bombs, military vehicles on the streets, Camaudia black and tents playing in the background. At the time of this decades-long, bloody, low-scale conflict, the median age in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland was around 25 years, similar to Guatemala or Libya today. It is no coincidence that the supply of young men willing to inflict casualties for the cause was very high, and that the conflict slowly began to de-escalate throughout the 1990s, just as the fertility rate started to decline and the median age started to climb up. That is not to espouse demographic determinism. Other factors, such as political negotiations or the Irish economic rise, certainly play a role as well. But the efforts to curtail the conflict had strong demographic headwinds on their side. That goes for all the other examples as well. Demographics were not the primary reason for these conflicts. Still, they created a fertile ground on which economic, political, ethno-religious and other factors could easily escalate to cause such conflict. Another well-known homegrown European terrorist campaign, the Basque ETA, has murdered almost 900 people in Spain since the 1960s. And once again, it is no coincidence that the violence culminated in the 1970s and 1980s, when the median age in Spain was around 30 years. And as in Ireland, the violent campaign slowly started to diminish, just as Spain started to age significantly. As Paul Morland writes in the book, the protests that erupted in Catalonia after the suspended referendum on independence in 2017 could have had very different and much bloodier development if Catalonia was not one of the oldest regions in Europe with median age in mid-40s, especially for ethnic Catalonians, that likely care the most about this issue. We all know how the internal ideological polarization within Spain turned out at times when the Spanish median age was around 20 years. Similar speculation can be made about the protests in Hong Kong or Belarus that took place in the 2019 to 2021 period, and were concerned about Hong Kong's legal separation from the People's Republic of China in the former case, and the falsified Belarusian presidential elections in the latter case. I'm not saying that the outcomes of these protests would have been necessarily different. Still, it is very likely that if the median age of both societies were not over 40, they would have the potential to get significantly more violent and explosive. The governments would have to use significantly more brutal oppressive measures to suppress them. In this way, older populations benefit the ruling classes, since, while they cause a plethora of serious economic issues, it is much easier for various regimes to hold on to power without major insurgencies by the population. Since the Yugoslav wars, the median age in that region has risen by over a decade. One just needs to spend some time in the aging and depopulating Balkans to assess that any sort of new, large-scale violent ethnic conflict there is highly unlikely, since, for it to happen, all the Serbs, Bosniaks and Albanians in Germany, Austria, Sweden and the UK would have to get in their BMWs and drove home to fight. Not very likely. Even in the 1990s itself, the conflict had a significant demographic element to it, since the Serbs were older than the Bosniaks and much older than the Albanians, and it was thus, to a certain extent, a conflict of aging and demographically retreating ethnic group to maintain control over areas inhabited by more demographically vibrant populations. The Arab Spring provides another example of geopolitical mayhem with a considerable demographic component to it. The region experienced a massive youth bulge in the 2010s. The median age in most countries experiencing the biggest riots was about 20, and the weak regional economies could not absorb massive numbers of youngsters entering the working age, especially the college-educated males with aspirations for social mobility. In the Middle East, there has been a postponement of marriage for young people in the last couple of decades, caused by economic factors like unemployment, housing costs, and the cultural tradition of dowry. The average Middle Eastern male gets married in his early 30s, which is relatively late, and there are also still strong cultural taboos regarding premarital sex in place in the region. Some analytics thus conclude that there was also a massive sexual frustration bubbling under the surface. Combined with the crisis of food prices caused by fertilizer price increases, this created a perfect storm for a wave of instability fueled by millions of young, single, unemployed and radicalized young males. In some countries, like Libya or Syria, this has resulted in bloody and protracted civil wars that have basically torn the countries apart. The ballooning demographics of these countries, where the fertility rates in the 1980s and 1990s were still around 5 children per woman, provided basically an inexhaustible reservoir of combatants, even if there were massive casualties and emigration waves. In this regard, the demographic situation of the Middle East was somewhat similar to Europe around World War I. In the 1920s and 1930s, violent street gangs of fascist and communist supporters in Germany, Spain or Italy, fighting in the streets or terrorizing people, were common occurrences. Once again, one look at the population pyramids of these countries at the time is enough to immediately see the reason why. The median age was in the early 20s, and millions of young males were without sufficient economic opportunities and often with combat experiences in the ideologically chaotic post-World War I environment. Europeans love to pat themselves on the backs about their suddenly gained moral maturity and peacefulness, but we mostly just got old. Studies of decades-long periods reveal that there are almost no civil wars in countries where 55% or more of the population is over 30 years old. In Lebanon, a bloody civil war took place between 1975 and 1990, with more than 150,000 casualties. In the decades before the civil war, the fertility rate in Lebanon was around 6 children per woman, and the median age in 1975 was 17 years. In the last 2 decades, the fertility rate has stabilized just above 2 children per woman, and the median age has increased to 29 years. While Lebanon is very far from being a stable state, it has avoided another open civil war, even though it is in the very precarious position of various sectarian religious groups sharing the impoverished country, and the Shia paramilitary organization Hezbollah residing in Lebanon. One of the reasons might be that when civil war broke out in Lebanon in the 1970s, the average 20-year-old man would have been one of 3 brothers and one of 6 children. Today, by contrast, the average 20-year-old Lebanese man is one of just 2 children. If we look at the long conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza, demographics are once again a profound part of the equation. The Gaza Strip has one of the youngest populations in the world, and the fertility rate in Gaza was over 8 children per woman in 1991. Half of the population is under 18. You already know what that means. Almost an inexhaustible reservoir of potential combatants, since young males without any economic prospects whatsoever comprise a massive chunk of the population. And due to the Gazan population pyramid actually looking like a pyramid, there are even more young boys that will grow to be men in a decade or 2. So, I would not bet on this conflict really ending anytime soon. Similar principles apply to violent revolutions and regime changes. In the times of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Russian population pyramid looked like that of the poorest African countries today. During the 1979 Iranian Islamic Revolution, the median age in Iran was under 20 years. During the Chinese Cultural Revolution, where the ideologically radicalized youth wreaked havoc over the country, the median age was once again in late teens. I have already mentioned the 1960s Cultural Revolution in the West, which, while nowhere near as violent as the other examples, was also carried on the backs of the massive post-World War II baby boom generation. This demographic imperative applies mostly to conflicts with a significant element of spontaneity and organic development, like in civil wars and revolutions. In more conventional military conflicts between states, demographic factors also play a major role, but as the war between Russia and Ukraine shows, even 2 states in pretty dire demographic conditions can wage a large-scale war for quite a long time. If a conflict starts by a government deciding it will start, the situation is obviously different than in the case of civil wars or more organic conflicts. So, there definitely will be military conflicts, although demographics most likely won't allow anything of the magnitude of a world wars to happen. Most industrialized states will be very reluctant to let their young population perish. We might see a big return of mercenaries onto the stage, and also a preference for drafting older males before the younger ones. Something already happening in Ukraine. Now, to stay in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Maidan revolution from 2014 might serve as an example of a spontaneous and relatively violent regime change happening in a country where the median age approached 40 at the time. People will claim that it was not spontaneous, and that various external players heavily nefariously interfered. And alright, maybe. The point is that this sort of demographic analysis is not some kind of natural law, like the law of gravity, that just must apply all the time, otherwise it is wrong. It is a social science thing. There will be a considerable exceptions and nuances. It is a matter of relative probability. Civil war or violent revolution might happen in an aging society, but the probability is much, much lower than in young societies with an abundance of young males. The fact that the West, and especially its native populations, is very old and continues to age, significantly influences my overall analysis of its future prospects. It seems that all societies have significantly weaker ability for collective action. They are risk-averse, they prefer not shaking up the status quo, and they fear violence. They have much more to lose and much less to gain from it. They are also more peaceful and stable and have lower crime rates. These traits, characteristic for the mature populations, then prevail in the overall societal zeitgeist, as the mature populations comprise the bulk of the society. All societies are not like powder kegs, ready to explode after some spark sets a fuse on fire. They are a status quo preserving machines that are very suitable for slow, long decay. That is exactly what we can observe in the oldest countries on the planet, like Japan, Italy, and Germany. Young males are a retreating demographic group with a diminishing share of the population in every Western country, and this is especially true for the native young males of European ancestry. Even in countries with relatively healthier demographics, like the United States or France, the median age of the population is nevertheless approaching 40, and is pulled down mostly by its non-white components. In the United States, the median age of the non-Hispanic white population is around 45 years now, which is on par with some of the oldest countries on the planet. In the UK, the median age of the white population is around 44 years, while the median age of the non-white population is around 32. In France, we lack precise ethnic data, but according to a Pew Research Center study from 2017 on the age difference between Muslims and non-Muslims, which can serve as a sort of imperfect proxy data for ethnic composition, the median age of French Muslims was 27 years, and for non-Muslims it was 43 years. And that was 7 years ago. In the demographically more damaged countries like Germany, Italy or Spain, the median age of the natives is most likely already in the 50s. One also had to consider other factors. The often mentioned decline in testosterone levels among men in developed countries might considerably weaken the aforementioned biological traits connected to youth, like aggression and impulsivity. The overstimulation provided by the never-ending supply of online entertainment like social media, Netflix, video games and adult content also contributes to the lower tendency to cause real-life troubles. Another factor is that even if the economic prospects of young adults are worsening, a considerable number of them are also predisposed to inherit some wealth from their parents, due to being only children or one of two siblings at best, which would further curtail their proclivity for radicalization. If the current conditions seen in many Western countries were to occur in populations with much younger demographic profiles, we might have already seen explosions of violence, revolutions or civil wars. We do see occasional outbursts of violence and rioting in the streets of Western countries. There are periodic riots and protests in France, some perpetrated by populations of immigration backgrounds, and some more by the ethnic French, like the Yellow Vests or the pension reform protests. There were anti-immigration riots in Ireland, a country where there still actually is a reasonably young ethnically Irish cohort of the population, or recently in the UK. There were the Black Lives Matter riots in the US in 2020. Here, we can once again observe the population bulge of black Americans in their 20s, and the January 6th riots in the Capitol in 2021. However, these riots never caused a chain reaction that resulted in the escalation towards some broader conflict. Governments can comfortably sit them out. As I said before, aging populations are also an advantage from the point of governments, since they do not have to fear their populations that much. Western governments clearly do not. Because the crucial variable, the masses of young discontent males with lots to gain and not much to lose, comprising a considerable chunk of the population, just ain't there. In the United States, where the possibility of civil war is relatively often brought up, males aged 15 to 35 comprise less than 14% of the population, and the non-Hispanic white males in that age group are about 7% of the population. It is usually estimated that the sort of powder keg demographic mix is such, where at least a third of the population is in this cohort. Now, I might be wrong, of course. As I said, we are talking about social phenomena, not natural laws. This rule might apply until it just does not. But so far, it seems pretty reliable. That, of course, does not mean that nothing will ever happen, as the skeptical guy from the meme tries to persuade us. We might see significant political changes, but I would, based on the analysis of the demographics of the developed world, not count on this development being a highly violent outburst of ethnic or class conflicts, or regime changes made by men with guns in their hands. It's more like a slow creeping transformation, with possible occasional violence that is very limited in scope.